Hi all, I hope you are doing well. This is my first video recording and I'm experimenting on you. So thanks for letting me try this out and we'll see how it goes. I wanted to talk to you a little bit today about character analysis. You're going to have to know how to do this for your reading response on Romeo and Juliet. So let's see if I can pull up the PowerPoint. The PowerPoint you can find on Blackboard under lecture notes, and it's called Character Analysis. Okay. I'm going to try to keep this as a mini lecture. So I'm going to try to keep it at about 20 minutes. So let's see how we go. Okay. Character analysis. Now I'm going to give you a general overview of character analysis for literature, but I will infuse into this conversation also a little bit about how we use it in Shakespeare, because it is sometimes a little bit different. Okay, so what you need to know, I think, first of all, for your reading response for next week is I think you have to discuss whether or not the friar is a flat or round character. Now, if I were in class with you right now, I would say how many of you have heard of this before. Maybe you've heard of it as static or dynamic. It's essentially the same thing. What we have is a continuum where we have a flat character, and a flat character generally has no change. Okay, there's no change in that character from the beginning to the end of the play or the piece of literature or whatever it is that you're reading. There's also very little energy given it to developing that character, right? So we are forced, therefore, to kind of draw on stereotypes or perhaps metaphors. So for example, if we were thinking about Romeo and Juliet, we might think of, and I don't mean to suggest that Mercutio is not a complex character, but he might fit the typical buddy stereotype. And so if we didn't want to develop him, everybody could kind of tap into like, okay, we get the buddy, and we wouldn't really have to characterize him very much because we all understand that stereotype. So then there is the round character, and your round character does, by definition, experience some kind of change, right? Usually as a result of a conflict that's been developed in the story. There's usually some kind of epiphany, and as a result of that, the character is forever changed. Another distinction between a flat and round character is the flat characters are generally not very complex, right? They generally don't surprise us. They're pretty predictable, and we don't really need to know them very much. For example, if we look at Hamlet and we think of Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, they're very flat. They're not complex. We don't even really have to know which one is which. They're almost identical. And so that's how we can distinguish that from, say, a round character, where if we were to look at Gertrude, right? Gertrude in Hamlet, she's a bit complex. We don't understand why she's making the choices that she's making. She's not your typical mother character. She's not your archetypal queen. She does seem to have been in love with her husband, and yet she does seem to also be in love with Claudius. So there's some complexity there that is worth exploring. So when we would go to analyze these characters, what we would look at by the way, let me just make this very clear. It's very hard to find a completely flat character and a completely round character. They're usually somewhere on the spectrum, more flat than round, more round than flat. But if we were looking at a flat character, what we would be looking at once we have identified the character as flat is what kind of stereotype is being represented here, or what kind of metaphor is being represented, and analyze the impact of that stereotype or that metaphor. What is being said about that stereotype? What is being said about that metaphor? And then begin to use that to help us understand the overall play. And a round character, what we would be looking at is, of course, the change. How does the character change? What is the impact of that change? We would be looking at analyzing the complexity. For example, how is it possible? It seems paradoxical that Gertrude could love both Claudius and Hamlet Sr. So we would want to take a look at that and see how does that help us understand the play. Okay? Now, other questions that we ask with literary characters is whether or not they're major, minor, or silenced characters, right? Your major character will be your typical protagonist, antagonist. They usually have a lot of space, they get a lot of energy, they have a lot of lines in the play, and they tend to be developed quite a bit. The minor characters are less developed usually. And then the silenced characters would be, say, like Rosalind in Romeo and Juliet. She gets referenced, but she has absolutely no lines. She gets no space on stage. It's really hard to be a completely silenced character, but they can be silenced and almost virtually silenced and still not quite reach minor. All of these characters are worthy of exploration. We tend to too often, I think, focus on the major characters, such as Hamlet, and perhaps not enough on the minor characters, such as Ophelia, or even the silenced characters, such as Rosencrantz and Guildenstern. So what I'm asking you to do with Romeo and Juliet, then, is to take a look at some of the characters besides Romeo and Juliet when thinking about your minor and silenced characters. Particularly in Shakespeare, I think that we're going to find really a lot more information about how to understand the play by looking at our minor and silenced characters than we are going to find in our major characters, because often, quite frankly, they end up being archetypes. Not necessarily true, say like with The Taming of the Shrew, Kate is not your archetypal powerful woman, and she becomes quite complex. So every rule that I give you, understand that Shakespeare is going to break somewhere along the line in one or more of the plays. Another way that we look at characters is we look to see how do other characters react to that character, and what do we think of them based on those perceptions. We look at them to see if they're reliable characters. Do they blame others for their actions, or do they accept responsibility for their own choices? And of course, we look at race, class, and gender. Now, that is a broad category that we will look at in Shakespeare, but I want you, especially for the assignment coming up, think of other things. We think of sexuality, we think of religion, we think of able-bodiedness, all of these things that would tend to marginalize a character. So when thinking about the friar, think about his religion. Remember, we're at a time now in the Renaissance that was highly anti-Catholic. So not only do we have a minor character in the friar, but we have one that is ostracized by the current regime in England. You're going to look at that character and you're going to think about whether or not you think he's flat or whether he's round. If he's flat, what stereotype is he representing? What metaphor is he representing, and how does that help us understand the play? If he's round, what change does he undergo? How is he complex? Does he make decisions that surprise us? And how does that help us understand the play? So that is a little, I think I've used up my 20 minutes, so I will leave the rest of the slides for you to look at, but I think you have enough now to answer the remaining reading response for next Friday or next Thursday, I think it is. I'm not sure. Check your syllabus, and we'll continue this conversation later. Hope this was useful. Bye.